All right, let's just dive right into this. Welcome to this explainer where we're going to do something honestly incredibly fascinating. We are taking a 2,500-year-old traditional practice, acupuncture, and we are meticulously unpacking the modern biophysics and the neurochemistry that actually make it work. For the longest time, the language used to describe acupuncture was steeped in these ancient metaphors. But today we've got the imaging and the hard biological data to see exactly what is happening inside the human body the second a needle is inserted. Let's get into it. To really understand how this ancient Eastern practice collided with modern Western science, we've got to look at this wild historical hook. The year is 1971. James Reston, who was a highly respected columnist for the New York Times, was actually over in China covering the geopolitical opening right before President Nixon's visit. Well, out of nowhere, he suffers acute appendicitis and needs an emergency appendectomy. Now, the surgery itself used standard chemical anesthesia, but during his recovery, Reston was just in agony, severe post-op abdominal distension and pain. So the hospital's acupuncturist comes in, inserts just 3 thin needles, 1 in his elbow, 2 below his knees, and burns this herb called mugwort near his abdomen. And get this, within an hour, his severe pain was completely relieved. Reston ended up writing a front-page article about it, and just like that, he sparked what literally became known as acupuncture fever here in the West, which launched a massive wave of scientific research. So, here's the roadmap for our explainer today. We'll be hitting 1. Ancient roots, 2. Connective tissue, 3. Chemical messengers, 4. Rewiring the brain, 5. Clinical efficacy, and finally 6. Acupuncture versus dry needling. Let's kick things off with Section 1, Ancient Roots and Western Discovery. The story really starts way back around 500 BC, which is when traditional Chinese medicine first mapped out these energy pathways, or meridians, across the body. But how on earth did this mystical-sounding concept catch the intense, rigorous attention of modern science? Well, after James Reston's famous article in '71, scientists basically rushed to the labs to figure out, is acupuncture just a sensory distraction, like a placebo, or does it have a real physical biological basis? Enter 1973. Researchers did this wild study where they took cerebrospinal fluid from rabbits that had just received acupuncture, and they infused that fluid into the brains of untreated rabbits. And amazingly, those untreated rabbits showed a huge, measurable increase in their pain thresholds. This proved definitively that the pain suppression was humoral, meaning it was driven by actual physical chemical messengers traveling through the fluid of the nervous system, not just some psychological trick. Which brings us to Section 2, the connective tissue response. For centuries, acupuncturists have described this phenomenon called D-Qi. For the patient, it kind of feels like this heavy, warm ache. And for the practitioner, it actually feels like the patient's tissue is grabbing the needle. For a long time, that sounded like magic. But modern biophysics has finally given us the literal translation for this. It's a mechanical tissue coupling. It's a highly specific, totally physical reaction happening right there in the body's fascial planes. And this perfectly illustrates the exact biomechanical sequence of what's going on. When a practitioner inserts and then twists that tiny needle, the loose subcutaneous connective tissue literally winds around the metal shaft, kind of like spaghetti on a fork. This mechanical tension stretches the local fibroblasts. Those are the cells making up the connective tissue. Under this physical stretch, those fibroblasts release ATP, a molecule of energy, right into the extracellular space. That ATP rapidly breaks down into adenosine, which then goes and binds to high-affinity A1 receptors on your peripheral pain nerves. And boom, pain transmission is locally suppressed. We're talking about an ancient technique being explained entirely by modern cellular mechanotransduction. How cool is that? All right, moving on to Section 3, neuropeptides and chemical messengers. To really grasp this next part, we have to look at the groundbreaking work of Dr. Ji-Seng Han. He discovered that you can actually attach tiny electrical currents to these needles, a practice we call electroacupuncture, to trigger the release of the body's own natural painkillers, our endogenous opioids. And Dr. Han proved this in such a clever way. He administered naloxone, which is a drug that completely blocks opioid receptors. When the naloxone was given, the pain-relieving effects of the acupuncture completely vanished, which proved, without a doubt, that the body was essentially acting as its own internal pharmacy, manufacturing its own opioid-like relief. So the really crucial takeaway here is that practitioners can actually dial in specific frequencies to act like a highly targeted, customized pharmacy. Take a look at this. If they use a low frequency, say between 2 and 10 hertz, the brain releases endorphins and enkephalins. These are absolutely fantastic for neurotactic pain or even treating opioid withdrawal. But if they crank it up to a high frequency of around 100 hertz, the body releases dynorphins instead, which are super effective for things like spinal cord injuries and severe spastic pain. It's literally an incredibly precise neurological hack. Let's zoom out a bit for Section 4, rewiring the brain and the central nervous system. The specific neural pathways involved here are just absolutely fascinating. The pain inhibitory signals generated by those tiny needles travel all the way up the spinal cord to critical regions in the brain, like the periaqueductal gray matter and the hypothalamus. Essentially, the physical stimulation happening way out there at the surface of the skin is directly activating the brain's massive descending pain modulatory system. And here's the thing, this isn't just some temporary chemical rush. It actually physically rewires the brain. Modern fMRI scans definitively prove that acupuncture changes our resting state functional connectivity. For example, in patients dealing with chronic pain, a brain region called the default mode network is often hyperactive. Acupuncture actually reduces that hyperactivation. At the same time, it increases connectivity in the sensor motor network, and it even normalizes asymmetry in the thalamus. Plus, in stroke rehabilitation, MR spectroscopy shows it actually improves metabolic ratios in ischemic brain lesions, which promotes anti-inflammatory actions and neurogenesis. The brain is literally physically remodeling itself away from chronic pain and injury. Now let's look at the big picture in Section 5, Clinical Proof and Efficacy. Okay, I really want you to focus on this number for a second. 20,827. That is the exact number of unique individual patient data sets analyzed across 39 high-quality randomized controlled trials by the Acupuncture Trialists Collaboration. I mean, we're not talking about a small anecdotal study here. This was a massive, rigorous gathering of raw patient data to answer once and for all, does acupuncture actually work for chronic pain? When we look at how this plays out in the data, the results are crystal clear. Verum, which means real, authentic acupuncture, provides a clinically significant effect over doing nothing, showing an effect size of 0.5 standard deviations. But even more importantly, it successfully beats out sham acupuncture. Now, sham acupuncture is when researchers use a device that maybe just pokes the skin, or they deliberately use the wrong points. The fact that real acupuncture outperforms the sham versions proves that there is a specific underlying physiological mechanism tied to proper needle insertion, not just a placebo effect. And honestly, what's truly remarkable is the durability of it all. Acupuncture isn't just a temporary band-aid. That massive dataset we just talked about showed that an incredible 85% of the initial pain-relieving benefit is retained a full year after the treatment course ends. 85%! This completely aligns with the fMRI data we saw earlier about the brain physically rewiring its pain networks over time. Because of this incredibly rigorous data, the leading Western medical institutions are fully on board now. The American College of Physicians officially recommends acupuncture as a first-line treatment for chronic low back pain. The American College of Rheumatology recommends it for knee osteoarthritis. The data also strongly backs up its use in reducing the frequency of migraines and treating myofascial pain syndrome. So we're seeing this ancient practice become completely integrated into standard modern medical guidelines. Finally, let's clear up some common confusion in Section 6, acupuncture versus dry needling. You've highly likely heard of both of these, and while they definitely look similar to the naked eye, they are grounded in completely different frameworks. Traditional acupuncture is based on a very holistic 2,500-year-old framework of balancing systemic energy, or qi, along historical meridians. Dry needling, on the other hand, was really developed in the 20th century. It is based strictly on a Western biomedical framework and is used almost exclusively to target very localized muscular trigger points to elicit a local twitch response. So, the huge takeaway here is that while the instrument, that super thin filiform needle, is exactly the same, the philosophy, the training, and the actual application are totally different. Scientifically speaking, dry needling overlaps heavily with the physiological concepts of acupuncture, making it essentially a highly localized subcategory of Western medical acupuncture. But remember, it's just one specific tool, whereas traditional acupuncture treats a much, much broader range of systemic issues. It is genuinely mind-blowing to see a 2,500-year-old practice get completely, thoroughly decoded by modern fMRI machines, cellular biology, and massive clinical datasets. The journey of a single needle spans all the way from ancient Eastern philosophy right to the bleeding edge of Western neurochemistry, which leaves us with a pretty fascinating thought to end on. As we continue to uncover the rigorous biophysics behind these ancient arts, what other traditional therapies might modern science validate next? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer. Keep learning and keep questioning.